The rotor wash off the tarmac at Bagram threw grit sideways across the flight line, and Warrant Officer Emily Shaw stood in it without blinking. She was 5'4" in her boots, and the youngest pilot on the ramp, and the 3 men waiting by the Black Hawk had already decided what she was. She could see it in the way they looked past her, the way you look past a kid who has wandered into the wrong hangar. One of them, a broad-shouldered crew chief named Dale Brandt, actually laughed. Not at her, exactly, at the idea of her. "That's the one they're sending up?" he said to the man beside him, loud enough to carry. "She looks like she should be handing out the coffee." Emily said nothing. She checked her harness. She checked the load. She looked up at the mountains to the north, where the weather was stacking gray and heavy against the peaks, and she felt the thing she always felt before it started, a stillness that came down over her like a helmet visor, quiet and total. The men did not know it yet, but before this day was over, every one of them would say her name like it was something holy. Before this day was over, the ones who came home would come home because a woman they had laughed at flew into a mountain pass alone and didn't come out until everyone else was safe. But that was hours away. Right now there was only the grit and the laughter and the long, cold morning ahead. If you're the kind of person who believes people should be measured by what they can do and not by how they look doing it, subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. Stay to the end, because there is a moment coming, a moment on a radio, in the dark, when a man who called her nothing has to say her name and beg. And you will want to be here when it comes. Let me take you back. 8 years before that morning on the flight line, Emily Shaw was 19 and learning to fly in the high desert of Arizona, where the air is thin and honest, and it punishes anyone who lies to it. Her instructor was a woman named Ruth Mercer, 61 years old, a former test pilot with hands like tree roots and no patience for softness. Ruth had flown everything the Army owned across 4 decades, and she had washed out more cocky young pilots than she could count, and she saw something in Emily that she never quite named. "You fly like you're apologizing," Ruth told her once, on a morning when the thermals were rolling the little training helicopter around like a leaf. "Stop it. The air doesn't care if you're sorry. The air only cares if you're right." Emily had white knuckles on the controls that day. She was chasing the aircraft, correcting after every bump instead of before it, and Ruth reached over and put one gnarled hand flat on the dashboard. "Feel where it wants to go," Ruth said. "Then be there first. You don't muscle a machine like this. You listen to it and you get there before it does. That's the whole secret. Everything else is noise." Emily flew for 3 more hours that day until her flight suit was soaked through and her hands ached. And somewhere in the 3rd hour, she stopped chasing and started listening. The helicopter went quiet under her. Ruth didn't say anything. She just nodded once, the way she did maybe twice a year, and that nod was worth more than any medal Emily would ever be handed. Ruth was still alive. That was the thing Emily carried. Ruth was 70 now, living in a low adobe house outside Tucson with a bad hip and a sharp tongue, and every few months Emily called her, and every few months there was one conversation they never finished. It sat between them like a stone. 9 years ago, before Emily ever enlisted, Ruth's son had died. His name was Michael, and he was a medevac pilot, and he went down in bad weather in a mountain pass that the forecast had called clear. Ruth never talked about the crash. What she talked about, on the rare nights she talked at all, was the radio. Michael had called for help. He had called, and the channel had stayed empty because the nearest aircraft had been grounded by a commander who decided the weather was too risky to launch into. "They heard him," Ruth said once, her voice flat as a frozen lake. That's the part. They heard him ask, and they decided he wasn't worth the risk, and they turned the radio down. Emily had never known what to say to that. She still didn't. Every time she picked up the phone to call Ruth, that empty channel was in the room with her, and she never once managed to promise the old woman the thing she wanted to promise. That if Emily were ever the one on the other end of that radio, she would launch. That she would always launch. The words never came. They sat in her throat like gravel, and she hung up every time, having said nothing that mattered. The unit Emily flew with was a special operations aviation element, the pilots who fly the hardest missions in the worst conditions, the ones who go in low and fast at night to pull people out of places nobody should have to be pulled out of. It was elite, and it was small, and it had exactly one woman flying line missions, and that woman was Emily Shaw. She had earned her seat with a check ride so clean, the evaluator had gone quiet at the end of it. But a check ride is a piece of paper, and paper doesn't stop a man like Dale Brandt from laughing at you on a flight line. Brandt was not a stupid man, and he was not a bad one. He was a crew chief with 11 years in, and he was very, very good at his job, and he had watched too many people he liked come home in bags. He had built a wall around himself out of certainty, and the certainty said that a small young woman did not belong in the left seat of an aircraft that flew into the places they flew into. He said it in the ready room. He said it in the chow hall. He said it where she could hear it, because he wanted her to hear it, because he thought if he was loud enough, she might quit before she got someone killed. "It's not personal," he told another crew chief, a quiet older man named Frank Doyle, the two of them leaning against a fuel truck, while Emily ran her pre-flight 40 feet away. "I've seen it a dozen times. They come in with the scores and the ribbons, and then the night gets bad, and the mountains close in, and they freeze. And when they freeze, my guys don't come home. I'd rather she hate me on the ground than have me write about her in the air." Frank Doyle didn't answer right away. He was watching Emily's hands. She was checking the tail rotor, and she did it the way you'd check a thing you loved. Quick and sure, no wasted motion, every fingertip landing exactly where it needed to land, and nowhere else. Frank had been around aircraft for 26 years, and he knew what he was looking at, even if he couldn't have put it into words. He knew that hands like that didn't freeze. "Maybe," Frank said. And then, because he wasn't a man who liked to argue, he let it go. But he kept watching her, and something in him filed itself away, and he didn't forget it. There was one man on that flight line who already believed in her, and his name was Grant Sullivan, and he was her co-pilot. Grant was 34, a broad, calm Nebraskan who had flown with Emily for 2 years and had stopped noticing her size about 10 minutes into their first mission together. He tracked things out loud, the way some pilots do, narrating the world so the cockpit always knew where it stood. He was the one who kept the count. He was the one, later, who would say the number over and over until it meant something. That morning they flew a supply run north, an easy hop, ammunition and water and mail, to a fire base tucked into the mountains near the Pakistani border. On the way back, they were laughing about something, Emily and Grant, some dumb joke about the firebase cook, and for a few minutes the cockpit was warm and loose and good. Emily had a laugh that surprised people. It came from somewhere deep, and it lit up her whole face. And Grant had learned that the woman who almost never spoke on the ground would sometimes, in the air, with the aircraft humming right and the world spread out below, become someone else entirely. Someone at home. "You ever think about what you'll do when you're done?" Grant asked her, somewhere over the brown folds of the valley. "No," Emily said. "Come on, everybody thinks about it." Emily was quiet for a moment, hands light on the controls, feeling where the air wanted to go and being there first. "Teach," she said finally. "Maybe, like Ruth." "Yeah?" "Yeah." And then she smiled, just a little, and didn't say anything else. And Grant let it be, because he'd learned that too. That was the morning. That was the last easy hour any of them would have for a long time. It came apart at 11:40. They were back on the ground at Bagram, Emily halfway through a cup of the terrible coffee Dale Brandt had once suggested was her true calling, when the alert tone went through the compound, like a wire pulled tight. Every head came up. Boots started moving before anyone had said a word, because in a place like that the body knows the sound of trouble before the brain catches up. A convoy had been hit. Not just hit, pinned. A joint reconnaissance patrol, 11 people, ambushed in a high mountain pass 40 minutes north, exactly the kind of terrain that the weather was closing over even as the call came in. They had rolled into a kill zone between two ridge lines and taken fire from above on both sides, and their vehicles were disabled, and they were down in the rocks, returning fire with the walls closing in. 11 souls. That was the number. 11 people who had left that morning expecting to come home. 11. The operations officer, a hard-jawed lieutenant colonel named Wade Holloway, stood in front of the map with the weather report in his hand and the worst decision of his month in front of him. The pass was socketing in, ceiling dropping, visibility collapsing, wind ripping down through the gap in the ridges at speeds that would throw a helicopter around like the little training aircraft in the Arizona thermals. Except here, the ground was rock, and the margins were gone. Every instinct in his body and every line in the manual said the same thing. Too risky. Wait for a break in the weather. But there was no break coming. The weather was going to sit on that pass for 6 hours, and the 11 people in the rocks did not have 6 hours. They had, by the estimate of the man on the radio down in the kill zone, maybe 90 minutes before they were overrun. Holloway knew what the manual said. He also knew, standing there, that if he waited for the weather, he would be the man who turned the radio down. He looked around the room, and he looked at the pilots, and he knew, everybody in that room knew, that there was exactly one aircraft commander on that ramp who could thread a socked-in mountain pass in wind like that and come out the other side. And he did not want it to be her. Not because she couldn't, because if she couldn't, he would have sent the smallest, youngest, most doubted pilot he had into a wall of rock, and he would carry it forever. "Shaw," he said. The room went quiet. "Sir." Emily was already standing. Holloway looked at her for a long moment, and what it cost him to say the next thing was written all over his face. Because saying it was admitting that all the doubt in that room, all of Brandt's certainty, was wrong, and that the person they'd been laughing at was the only one who could do this. "You're the only one who can fly that pass in this," he said. "I don't have anybody else. I need you to tell me right now. Straight, no hero talk. Can you get in there?" Emily didn't blink. "Yes." "You understand what I'm sending you into?" "Yes." Holloway held her eyes one more second. "Then go get them." She keyed her radio as she walked, already moving towards the aircraft, and her first transmission went out flat and clear and certain across a channel full of men who had spent weeks deciding she was nothing. All stations, this is Dustoff 6, launching for the pass. Tell those people to hold on. We're coming. Dale Brandt heard it from the flight line. He heard the voice, steady as a level, and for the first time something moved behind his certainty, some small cold doubt about the shape of his own doubt. But he didn't have time to look at it, because Holloway had just assigned him to her crew, and Dale Brandt was about to fly into that pass in the back of the aircraft he'd sworn she'd get him killed in. Grant slid into the right seat beside her. Frank Doyle, who had asked for the mission the second he heard the tail number, took the other door gun. And Dale Brandt, jaw tight, strapped in behind Emily's seat, close enough to see her hands. They lifted at 11:52. The first 20 minutes were only bad. The valley floor unrolled beneath them the color of rust, and the wind came at them in slaps, and Emily flew low and fast the way the mission demanded, hugging the terrain so the ridgelines would hide them from anyone watching. Grant called the numbers: torque, airspeed, the terrain sliding up in front of them, and Emily rising to meet it a half-second before it arrived, being there first, always first, the way Ruth had taught her in the honest desert air a lifetime ago. Ceiling's coming down, Grant said, 800 and dropping. I see it. Pass is going to be worse. I know. Behind her, Dale Brandt watched her hands on the controls and felt the aircraft do something he had rarely felt in 11 years of flying with the best. It stopped fighting. In the worst air he'd ever ridden through, the aircraft under Emily Shaw's hands went quiet, went smooth, went where it was told before it knew it wanted to go anywhere. Brandt had ridden with pilots who muscled the machine. This was something else. This was a conversation, and she was winning it. And he didn't say a word, because his mouth had gone dry. Then the pass swallowed them. The ridges came up on either side, and the gray came down from above, and suddenly they were flying in a box made of rock and cloud, the walls close enough that Frank Doyle could have counted the stones, the wind ripping down the throat of the gap and trying to slam them into stone with every gust. Visibility dropped to nothing and came back and dropped again. Emily flew it on instinct and instrument both. Hands light, always light, feeling where the wind wanted to throw the aircraft and being somewhere else before it got there. Downdraft, she said, and dropped the collective a beat before the air fell out from under them, and the aircraft sank with the falling air instead of being smashed by it, and rose again on the far side, and Dale Brandt's stomach came up into his throat and stayed there. "How are you doing that?" he said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. "Not now," Emily said. "Not cruel, just full." Every part of her was in her hands. The radio crackled. The voice from the kill zone, a patrol leader named Curtis Vance, ragged and stretched thin. "Any station? This is Ranger 26. We are taking effective fire from both ridgelines. We have wounded. We cannot hold this position. Where is our air? Over." Grant keyed back. "Ranger 26, Dustoff 6. We are 2 mics out and inbound in the pass. Hold what you've got. We're coming to you." 2 mics, Vance said, and the relief cracked his voice right down the middle. "Copy 2 mics. Hurry. 2 minutes. 11 souls. 90 minutes, bleeding down to nothing, and the walls of rock sliding past, close enough to touch. Then they came around the last dogleg of the pass and saw it. The kill zone opened below them. 2 disabled vehicles, nose to tail in the rocks, muzzle flashes stitching down from both ridgelines, and the small, desperate shapes of the patrol pressed into whatever cover the ground would give them. It was worse than the report. It was always worse than the report. There were fighters up on the high ground with a heavy machine gun, and that gun was walking rounds down into the rocks where the wounded were, and there was no way to land in that. No way at all, not with that gun up. "We can't put down with that gun firing," Grant said. "It'll cut us in half on short final." Emily saw it all in a single cold sweep. The gun position, tucked into a notch in the eastern ridge, protected on 3 sides by rock. Frank's door gun couldn't reach it at the angle they'd have to fly. The wind screaming down the pass. The vehicles. The wounded. The gun. And she saw the one thing that might work. And it was insane. And it was the only thing. "Frank," she said, "that gun's dug in on the east wall. You can't get it from a hover. But I can put you on it for about 4 seconds if I fly the pass backwards and drop us down the west face." A beat of silence in the cockpit. "Say again," Frank said. "There's a downdraft that comes off the west ridge every time the wind gusts through the gap. I've felt it 3 times now. It's regular. When it hits, it'll drop us 40 feet fast and sideways, right across the mouth of that notch. If I ride the downdraft, instead of fighting it, it'll swing your gun line right onto that position for about 4 seconds. You'll have 1 pass. 1. You have to take the gun in 4 seconds, or we come around and there might not be an us to come around." She was reading the wind off the west ridge the way you'd read a page. Every gust that funneled through the gap spilled down the western rock face in a hard, predictable fall. And where every other pilot alive would spend everything they had fighting that downdraft to stay level, Emily was going to climb into it on purpose and let it throw the aircraft exactly where she needed the guns to point. The mountain's own violence turned into a firing platform. 4 seconds, bought with the thing that was trying to kill them. "You're going to fall us onto the gun," Frank said slowly. "I'm going to fall us past it. You do the rest." Frank Doyle was quiet for 1 second. Then, "Do it." "Dale," Emily's voice. "When Frank's gun goes dry, or that position's down, we've got maybe 20 seconds before the West Ridge fighters range us. I'm going to put us down hard in the rocks by the lead vehicle. You've got to have that door open and be pulling people before we're settled. We are not going to have time to be gentle." "Copy," Brant said, and his voice had changed. Every ounce of the flight line certainty was gone out of it. What was left was a professional at the top of his craft, about to do the hardest thing he'd ever done. On the word of a pilot, he'd have bet his life against that morning, and was now betting it on. "Everybody hold on," Emily said. She climbed toward the west ridge. It was the exact wrong thing to do, flying up toward the rock wall in a wind that wanted to pace them against it, and every alarm in her own body screamed against it, and she overrode all of it, because Ruth's voice was in her head, clear as the desert morning. Feel where it wants to go. Then be there first. She felt the gust build. She felt it come funneling down the pass, saw the dust kick up off the west face, felt the aircraft start to shudder as the air began to spill. "Now," she said, and rolled into the downdraft. The mountain threw them, 40 feet in under 2 seconds, sideways and falling, the whole aircraft dropping down the west face like a stone off a roof. And the mouth of that notch swung up into the door gun's line exactly where she'd said it would be. The dug-in gun position suddenly framed dead in Frank Doyle's sights with nothing in the way. Frank fired. 4 seconds. The door gun hammered, brass streaming out into the falling air, rounds walking straight into the notch, and the enemy gun that had been chewing the rocks apart went silent under it. 4 seconds, and then the downdraft spat them out at the bottom of the west face, and Emily hauled in power and swung the nose, and the notch was behind them, and the gun was dead. "Gun's down!" Frank shouted. "Gun is down!" "Going in," Emily said, and dropped them toward the rocks by the lead vehicle, hard and fast, exactly as promised. They hit the ground harder than any landing in any manual, skids slamming into the rocks, and before they'd stopped moving, Dale Brandt had the door open and was out, roaring at the patrol to move, 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 and they came. Out of the rocks, dragging their wounded, the reconnaissance patrol broke cover and ran for the aircraft, while Frank's gun and Grant's voice and the whole screaming pass came down around them. It was chaos, and it was fast, and it was deadly. Emily held the aircraft on the rocks with the wind trying to tip them, hands never still, keeping them level and down while bodies piled in behind her. She heard Brandt's count over the intercom, hoarse and driving. "That's 4. That's 6. 2 more coming. We got 2 more coming." Rounds off the west ridge now, the other fighters finding the range, sparking off the rocks, one punching through the tail boom, with a sound like a hammer on a barrel. Frank swung his gun to the west and put fire up onto the ridge, buying seconds, buying lives. "9!" Brandt shouted. "That's 9! Where's the last 2? Where's the last 2?" And here was the moment the whole day would turn on, and it didn't belong to Emily Shaw. It belonged to Dale Brandt. The last 2 were down. 50 feet back in the rocks, the patrol leader, Curtis Vance, and one of his wounded, pinned behind a vehicle by fire coming off the west ridge, unable to move. And Dale Brandt, who that morning had said this woman would get his people killed, looked back at those 2 men in the rocks and did the bravest thing anyone did that day. He unclipped. He came off the aircraft, out from any cover, into the open, and he ran back across 50 feet of ground with rounds walking all around him, and he got a shoulder under the wounded man, and he hauled him up, and he dragged him, and half carried him back toward the aircraft, while Curtis Vance covered them both. He shouldn't have made it. By every law of that kill zone, he should not have made it. But Frank Doyle put a wall of fire up on that west ridge, and Emily held the aircraft steady as a table for him, and Dale Brandt ran through the impossible middle of it with a wounded man on his back and threw him into the cabin and turned and reached back for Vance. "That's 11!" he screamed. "11! Go! 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 11! All 11!" Emily Shaw pulled power the instant she felt the weight settle, and the aircraft came up off the rocks into the screaming wind, and she flew them out of the kill zone with the west ridge chewing the air behind them, down the throat of the pass she'd flown in on, into the wind and the rock and the gray. They were not out yet. Halfway down the pass, low on fuel, and heavy with 11 survivors, and taking wind that got worse the lower they went, the radio came alive with a voice nobody expected. It was Holloway, back at Bagram. And behind his transmission, Emily could hear another voice, and it took her a second to place it because she had never heard it sound like that. It was Dale Brandt's certainty, turned inside out. No, it was not Brandt. Brandt was in the back of her aircraft. It was the operations net, and the voice cutting across it, ragged and stripped of every ounce of the swagger it had carried that morning, belonged to the crew chief who'd been coordinating from the ground when they launched, a man named Roy Cobb, who had stood on that flight line at dawn and laughed along with Brandt, who had called her the coffee girl, who had bet out loud that she'd freeze. Now Roy Cobb was on the radio, and a second aircraft had launched behind her into the closing weather to cover her egress, and it had gone into the mountains and lost contact, and Roy Cobb had people of his own in that second aircraft, and the only pilot in the sky who could find them. In this was the one he'd spent weeks calling nothing. There was a silence on the channel first. 3 full seconds of dead air, where everyone waited to hear if he would say it. 3 seconds, and you could hear him breathing, and you could hear what it cost. Then Roy Cobb keyed the mic, and in a voice that had nothing left in it but the truth, he said her name. "Dustoff 6, Shaw." His voice broke on it and came back. "Shaw, we've got a bird down off your 2 o'clock in the North Fork, 4 souls, and you're the only one who can get in there. I know what I said. I know what I—" He stopped, started again. "Please, you're all they've got. Please, please." The words sat on the channel like a stone dropped in still water. Every man in earshot at Bagram heard Roy Cobb beg the coffee girl to save 4 lives. And in the back of Emily's aircraft, Dale Brandt heard it too, and put his forehead down against the wounded man he'd carried, and understood exactly what he was hearing, because that morning it could have been his voice. Emily's hands were steady on the controls. 4 more souls, 11 behind her, 4 ahead, 15. She keyed the mic. 2 words. "Send it." Roy Cobb sent the coordinates. North Fork of the pass, a side canyon even tighter than the one she'd flown. The downed aircraft wedged somewhere in the rock, with the weather sitting on top of it. She was heavy. She was low on fuel. She had 11 survivors in the back. She had just pulled out of hell, and she turned into the North Fork anyway, because there were 4 people in the rock, and the channel would not be empty. Not this one. Not while she was flying it. Was Emily? Grant, quiet beside her. "Fuel. I see it. We go in there. We might not have the gas to get back out and to Bagram both." Emily looked at the fuel. Grant was right. The math was the math. Go into the North Fork, find the 4, and there might not be enough left to carry 15 souls back over the mountains to Bagram. They'd get everyone out of the rock, and then come down somewhere in the dark with dry tanks. And into her head, unbidden, at the worst possible moment, came the memory she never looked at. Ruth's kitchen, the old woman's flat voice. They heard him ask, and they decided he wasn't worth the risk, and they turned the radio down. And Emily Shaw understood, in that cockpit, low on fuel with 15 lives in her hands, that she had spent 9 years unable to make Ruth a promise because she had never been sure, deep down, whether she was the kind of person who launched or the kind who turned the radio down. And here was the answer, and it had 4 souls in it, and she did not hesitate. "There's a fire base at the mouth of the North Fork," she said. "Old one. Coordinates are in the book. We drop these 11 there. We get light. We go get the 4. We set down at the fire base again, on the way back, and we all wait out the weather on the ground. Nobody flies dry over the mountains. Everybody lives." Grant looked at her. "That fire base might not even be manned. It's got a flat spot, and it's out of the wind. That's all I need." She keyed the radio. "Ranger 2-6, you and your people are coming off at a fire base in about 90 seconds. It's friendly ground. You wait there. Somebody'll come for you when this clears. I've got another bird down, and I've got to get light to reach them." Curtis Vance's voice came back, and there was something in it like wonder. "You're going back in? Ma'am, you're going back into that?" "4 more, Emily said. "Then everybody's home." She set them down at the fire base hard and fast, and the 11 came off, the walking and the carried both. And the last one out was Curtis Vance, who stopped in the door for 1/2 second and looked at the small woman in the pilot's seat with rounds still ringing in his ears and 11 of his people alive because of her. And he didn't have any words, so he just put his hand flat on the door frame of her aircraft for a moment, like you'd touch something you wanted to remember. And then he was gone, into the rocks, and she was pulling power again. Lighter now. Just the crew. Emily turned Dustoff 6 into the North Fork. If the first pass had been a box of rock and cloud, the North Fork was a coffin. Narrower, darker, the walls leaning in, the weather packed down into the gap so tight that Grant lost the horizon completely and flew on instruments and Emily's voice alone. She took them in low and slow, reading the wind-off walls she could barely see, feeling for the downed aircraft in a canyon that wanted to kill them for being in it. Ranger Rescue, this is Dustoff 6. I'm in the North Fork. Give me anything. A light, a flare, a voice. Anything. Over. Silence. She flew deeper. The fuel light was on now, a hard, steady glow. Ranger Rescue, Dustoff 6. If you can hear me, I am in the canyon looking for you. Give me a sign. Over. Silence. 3 seconds of it. 5. The dread came up in the cockpit like cold water. The empty channel, the thing Ruth heard, the nothing on the other end of the radio where a voice should be. Grant's jaw was tight. Frank had stopped calling numbers, and Emily flew on into the dark canyon, with the fuel light burning, and the silence pressing in, and every second stretching out into the shape of Ruth's grief. And then faint, cracked, from somewhere below in the rock. Dustoff! Dustoff 6! We hear you. We're here. The channel was not empty. Emily Shaw let out one breath. I've got you, she said. Hold on, I've got you. Nobody's turning this radio down. She found them wedged on a shelf of rock 40 feet below the canyon rim. The second aircraft down, but not burned. 4 souls alive in and around it. One of them badly hurt. There was no landing there. There was barely a hover. The canyon was too tight to bring the aircraft level with them, and the wind was trying to fold Dustoff 6 against the far wall, and the only way to get the 4 off that shelf was to hold the aircraft in a hover, with one skid nearly against the rock while they climbed and were dragged aboard, and to hold it there, in that wind, in that gap, for as long as it took. This was the thing that could not be done. Not by anyone. A hover pinned against a canyon wall in gusting downslope wind, holding an aircraft dead still in the air, over a 40-foot drop while people crossed onto it one at a time, with a fuel light burning and no margin left anywhere. One twitch, one gust unread, 1/2 second of mussing the machine instead of listening to it, and Dustoff 6 went into the wall and everyone died. The 4 on the shelf and the 4 in the aircraft, both. Emily brought them into the hover, and then she did the only thing she had ever really known how to do. She stopped flying the helicopter and started listening to it. She felt every gust before it arrived in the tremor of the airframe and the pressure on the pedals. And she was there first, every time, 100 tiny corrections a minute, holding 4,000 pounds of aircraft, as still as a photograph 6 feet off a canyon wall, while Frank Doyle leaned out into the void and reached down for the first of the 4. Feel where it wants to go, she said under her breath, to nobody, to Ruth, to the air. Then be there first. The first one came aboard. The aircraft lurched with the shifting weight, and she caught it before it moved, caught it before it knew it wanted to move. The second came aboard. A gust slammed down off the rim and tried to throw them into the wall, and she rode it down and back up and never let the skid touch stone. The third came aboard. The badly hurt one passed up hand over hand into Dale Brandt's arms. 3, Brandt said, hoarse. One more, Emily. Hold it, hold it. The fuel light burned. The wind screamed down the canyon, and Emily Shaw held Dustoff 6 dead, still in the killing air, while the fourth soul climbed up out of the wreck and reached up. And Frank Doyle caught his wrist and hauled, and he came over the edge and into the cabin and collapsed there. "4!" Brant shouted. "That's 4! That's all of them. Go!" 15 souls. Every single one. Emily eased Dustov 6 back off the wall, out of the hover, and turned the aircraft in a canyon barely wide enough to turn in, and flew them out of the North Fork on the last of her fuel and the last of the light, back to the fire base at the mouth of the pass, where 11 survivors and a flat spot out of the wind were waiting. She set them down soft, after everything, the softest landing of the day. As the fuel gauge read empty, and the weather closed the pass behind them like a door, the rotors wound down. For a long moment, nobody in the aircraft said anything at all. The silence had a different quality now. It was the silence of 15 people who were going to see another morning. And then, in the back, someone started to cry. It was one of the survivors from the second aircraft, a young medic who'd been sure he was going to die on that shelf, and once he started, he couldn't stop. And Dale Brant, the crew chief who had laughed at Emily Shaw on the flight line that morning, put a hand on the kid's shoulder and held on. And when he looked up toward the front of the aircraft, toward the small woman unstrapping in the pilot's seat, his own face was wet, and he was not ashamed of it. They were on that fire base for 11 hours before the weather broke enough to get them out. 11 hours in a cold stone outpost manned by a skeleton crew who could not believe what had just landed on their pad. 11 hours in which Emily Shaw finally let her hands do the thing they'd been refusing to do since 11:52 that morning. They started to shake. She sat with her back against a cold wall in the corner of the firebase's little operations room, away from the others, and she looked at her hands in her lap and watched them tremble like leaves in the Arizona thermals, and she let them because there was no one flying now, and it was finally allowed. That was where the wounded medic found her. His name was Nathan Larkin, 26 years old, and he'd been the badly hurt one they'd passed up hand over hand off the shelf, and somebody had patched him up as best they could, and he'd insisted on getting up and finding her. He lowered himself down against the wall beside her, careful of his bandaged side, and for a while he didn't say anything at all. Then, in the dark, he asked her the question. "On the shelf," Nathan said, "when you were coming in, I was sure we were done. I've never been that sure of anything. And then I heard your voice on the radio." He stopped. His own hands weren't steady either. "Am I going to make it? Straight. Nobody'll tell me straight." And here was the ordinary human thing about Nathan Larkin, the small unfinished detail he carried. And it came out of him there in the dark because he thought he might be dying, and it was the thing on his mind. His sister was getting married in the spring, back in Ohio, and he was supposed to walk her down the aisle because their father was gone. And he'd promised her, and he was terrified he'd broken the promise up on that shelf. "I'm supposed to walk my sister down the aisle," he said, "in May. I promised her. Is that, am I going to—" Emily Shaw looked at him, and she did the thing she did, the thing that was the truest part of her, which was to take a promise and turn it into a fact. "You're going to walk her down the aisle," Emily said. "Not a hope, not a maybe, a fact, set down flat and certain, the way Ruth set down the truth. You're going to be there in May. I didn't fly into that canyon to lose you on a fire base. You're going home, Nathan. That's not a wish. That's what's happening." Nathan Larkin looked at her for a long moment, and then something in his chest let go, and he believed her. because there was nothing in her voice that would let him do anything else. "Okay," he said. "Okay." They sat there a while longer in the dark. And then Nathan, because he was young and grateful and had almost died, said the thing. "How do you do it? How are you so calm up there when it's," he gestured at the world, the past, all of it. And this was where Emily Shaw cracked out loud, the once to another person, the thing she had never said to anyone. "I'm not calm," she said quietly. "I'm terrified. Every second. From the moment we lift to the moment we're down, I am as scared as you were on that shelf." She looked at her shaking hands. "There's a woman who taught me to fly. Ruth. Her son was a medevac pilot. He went down in weather like this, in a pass like this, and he called for help on the radio. And the nearest aircraft was grounded because a commander decided the risk was too high. They heard him ask, and they turned the radio down. And he died in the rocks, calling for people who could hear him." Nathan didn't say anything. He understood he was being handed something that didn't get handed to people. "I've known Ruth for 9 years, Emily said, "and in 9 years, I have never once been able to promise her that I would launch, that if I were the one on the other end of that radio, I would come, because I didn't know. I didn't know if I was the kind of person who flies into the pass or the kind who turns the radio down." Her voice was very low. "I'm scared every second I'm up there. But I'd rather be scared in the pass than be the silence on the radio. That's all it is. That's the whole thing. I'm not brave. I just decided which kind of person I was going to be, and now I don't get to be quiet about it anymore." Nathan Larkin, 26, alive, said the truest thing anyone said to her that whole long day. "Ruth's son," he said. "He called for help, and nobody came." He turned his head and looked at her in the dark. "You're the one who came. You've been the one who comes this whole time. You just didn't have anybody to tell you that you already answered the question. 9 years ago, you answered it the day you decided to fly." Emily Shaw sat very still in the dark. She had spent 9 years unable to look at the thing, and a 26-year-old medic with a hole in his side had just looked at it for her and said it plain, and it undid something in her chest that had been knotted so long she'd forgotten it could come loose. She didn't cry, but it was close, and Nathan saw it, and he had the grace to look away and let her have it. Outside, the wind came down off the pass and worried at the stone walls of the firebase, and inside, 15 people who were alive breathed in the dark. And Emily Shaw sat with the knot in her chest coming loose one strand at a time, and understood that the promise she'd never been able to make to Ruth was one she had already been keeping for 9 years without knowing it. The weather broke a little after midnight. They flew the survivors out in relays as fresh aircraft mated up from Bagram through the clearing pass, and by the gray of the next dawn, Emily Shaw was standing on the flight line at Bagram again, in almost the exact spot where Dale Brandt had laughed at her 22 hours before. She hadn't slept. Her hands had stopped shaking somewhere around 3 in the morning. Her flight suit was stiff with sweat and cold, and she stood in the rotor wash of the recovery birds and watched the last of the 15 come home. Colonel Holloway found her there. He had been up all night, too, and his face showed it, and he stood beside her for a moment, watching the aircraft settle onto the ramp, before he said what he'd come to say. "I almost didn't send you," he said. "You should know that. I stood in front of that map, and every rule I've got told me to wait for weather, and the only reason I didn't is I couldn't live with being the man who waited. He turned and looked at her. That was my failure, not my judgment. I let them talk about you the way they talked about you for weeks, and I said nothing, because part of me wondered if they were right. They weren't. I was wrong, and my silence was wrong. And I'm telling you that on this flight line, where they said it, because that's where it should be said. Emily didn't say anything. She'd learned that from Ruth, too. That some things you receive by staying quiet and letting them be true. There's going to be a review, Holloway said, of what happened up there. The flight data recorder, the whole track. What you did in that North Fork. Holding a hover, pinned to a wall in that wind, on empty, for 4 extractions. He shook his head. The instructors are going to say, it can't be done. I've already heard 2 of them say it. So the data's going to matter. The data mattered. 3 days later, a flight standards officer named Vivian Kane sent up from division to review the incident because the numbers coming off the recorder didn't make sense to anyone below her pay grade, sat in a small room at Bagram with the full flight track of Dustoff 6 laid out in front of her. She was a hard, precise woman with 14 years of evaluating pilots and a reputation for being impossible to impress. She had the instrument data, the recorded control inputs, the wind readings, the whole story the aircraft told about itself, second by second, through 22 hours. She read it in silence for a long time. And when she got to the North Fork, to the 4 minutes of hover data, the aircraft held dead still against a canyon wall in gusting 30-knot downslope wind. 4,000 pounds of helicopter kept inside a 2-foot box in the air, while the fuel ran to nothing. Vivian Kane stopped reading. She set the pages down on the table, and she went very quiet, the way people go quiet when the thing in front of them is bigger than their ability to be unimpressed by it. This isn't possible, she said to the empty room. Nobody flies like this. But the aircraft did not lie. The instrument log was the instrument log, and it recorded, input by input, a pilot doing the impossible thing for 4 straight minutes, on the last of her fuel. And Vivian Kane, who could not be impressed, sat alone with the proof of it, and put her hand flat on the pages, and did not move for a long while. The B-plot, the thing the operation could not resolve, resolved itself on a phone in a hallway at Bagram 4 days after the pass. Emily called Ruth. She stood in the cold hallway with the phone against her ear, and the old woman's voice came down the line from the adobe house outside Tucson, sharp as ever, 70 years old, and afraid of nothing except the one thing. I heard something happened up there, Ruth said. Word gets around. You going to tell me, or do I have to hear it third hand, from people who don't know a rotor from a rock? And Emily, who had never been able to make the promise, finally made it. Not as a promise anymore, as a thing that had already happened. Ruth, she said, there was a bird down in a canyon. 4 souls. Weather on top of it. No landing, nothing. The kind of call Michael made. She heard the old woman go still on the other end of the line. I launched. I went in. I got them. All 4. Plus 11 off a convoy before that. 15. The channel wasn't empty, Ruth. Somebody was on the other end this time. Somebody came. There was a long silence on the line. The kind of silence Ruth Mercer had lived inside for 9 years. Except this one had something different in it. You launched, Ruth said. Her voice was not flat now. It had a crack running all the way through it. I launched. And I've been trying to tell you something for 9 years, and I could never get it out because I didn't know if it was true. But it's true now. If it had been Michael on that radio, if it had been your boy calling in the rock, I would have come, Ruth. I would have launched into anything. I'd have flown into the mountain to get to him. I know that now, because I did it for 4 people I never met. Emily's voice was steady and low. He didn't die because nobody would have come. He died because the wrong person was on shift. There are people who come. I'm one of them. I've been one of them the whole time, and I'm sorry it took me 9 years to be able to tell you. Ruth Mercer wept, 3 states away, in her kitchen. Emily heard it. And when the old woman could speak again, she said the thing that closed the 9 years like a hand, closing over a stone worn smooth. He'd have liked you, Ruth said. My Michael. He'd have... Her voice broke and came back. He'd have flown with you. That's the highest thing I've got, and I'm giving it to you. He'd have flown with you, Emily. Now I don't have to wonder any more whether anyone would have come. Somebody would have. She's got my son's old instructor, and she flies like the air owes her money. A wet laugh. Go on, go do your work. Call me Sunday. I'll call you Sunday, Emily said. And this time, the promise was easy. Dale Brandt came to find her on the 6th day. She was doing a post-phase inspection on Dust-Off 6, which had earned its scars in the pass and wore them now, the patched tail boom, the stressed skids. Brandt came across the hangar toward her, and she saw him coming. And she kept working, because she wasn't going to make it easy, and she wasn't going to make it hard. She was just going to let it be whatever he'd come to make it. He stood there a while before he could start, This was a man who had never in his life had to find these particular words, and they came out of him in pieces. I ran back for those 2, he said finally. In the kill zone, Vance and the wounded one. I came off the aircraft, and I ran back. He stopped. I need you to know, I didn't do that to be brave. I did it because you flew us in there. Because you did the thing I said you couldn't do. And you did it better than I've ever seen anybody do it. And I was so ashamed of myself sitting in the back of your aircraft that when I saw those 2 men down in the rocks, I couldn't sit there. Not after what I'd said about you. Running into that fire was easier than sitting there being the man who'd said what I said. Emily set down her tools. She looked at him. I stood on this flight line, Brandt went on. And his voice was coming apart now, the certainty gone. Nothing left but a man looking at the true size of his own error. And I said you'd get my people killed. I said it where you could hear it. I wanted you to hear it. I thought I was protecting my guys, and what I was doing was... I was so sure. I was so sure. And I was so wrong. And there were 15 people alive who'd all be dead if I'd gotten my way and grounded you. And every one of them is walking around because you're exactly what I said you weren't. He stopped. His jaw worked. I don't have a way to say sorry that's big enough. I've been trying for 6 days. There isn't one. I laughed at you, and you saved my life. And I don't know how to hold both of those. Emily Shaw looked at the big man coming apart in front of her, and she did not forgive him cheaply, and she did not punish him. She gave him 3 words, and they were the right 3 words, and they were hers. Then don't laugh, she said. Dale Brandt looked at her, and then he nodded slow, and something settled in him that would stay settled for the rest of his life. And he understood that he'd been given more than he'd earned and exactly what he needed. No, he said, I won't. And he never did again. The family came 2 weeks later. Nathan Larkin's sister flew all the way from Ohio to Bagram, a thing that took strings and paperwork, and a determination that would not be told no, because her brother was alive, and she had been told, in the flat way the Army tells families things, that a helicopter pilot had held an aircraft against a canyon wall on an empty fuel tank to pull him off a ledge, and she was not going to let that be a sentence in a report. Her name was Karen, and she was 29, and she found Emily Shaw in the chow hall and stood in front of her, not knowing any of the words, because there are no civilian words for it. "You're her," Karen said. "You're the one who—" "Nathan told me. He tried to explain what you did, and I don't understand any of it. The wind and the fuel and the— I don't understand it. I don't have any way to understand it." Her eyes were streaming, and she wasn't wiping them. "All I know is my brother is going to walk me down the aisle in May because of you. Our dad's gone. It was always going to be Nathan. And there was a week where I thought I'd be walking down that aisle by myself. And now I'm not, because of something you did that I will never in my life be able to understand." Emily Shaw, who could hold an aircraft still in a killing wind, did not know what to do with this. She never did. She could take a promise and make it a fact in a cockpit with 15 lives on the line, but a crying woman in a chow hall thanking her for a wedding was a country she had no map for. "He's a good man, your brother," was all she could manage. He was worried about the promise, on the shelf, when he thought. That's what he was thinking about, walking you down the aisle. That's the man you raised him into, between the two of you. That's who was up on that rock. Karen put both hands over her mouth, and then she crossed the space between them and put her arms around Emily Shaw, who stood stiff for a second the way she always did, and then let herself be held by the sister of a man she'd pulled out of a canyon, and did not know she needed it until it was happening. The recognition, when it came in the ready room, and it was not a speech, because Emily Shaw would have walked out of a speech. It was 3 weeks after the pass. The unit had a new set of pilots rotating in, and the ready room was full, 30-some people, the whole element, crew chiefs and pilots, and the support staff packed into the low room where the mission boards hung. Holloway had called it for a briefing, an ordinary briefing, and Emily was in the back not expecting anything, and that was the point. Nobody had warned her, because if they'd warned her, she wouldn't have come. Holloway stood at the front, and instead of the briefing, he said, "Before we start, some of you are new. Some of you have heard a version of what happened in the Northern Pass 3 weeks ago. I want you to hear it right, one time, and then we won't make a thing of it, because the pilot in question would put in for transfer if we made a thing of it." A low laugh went around the room. Emily felt her face go hot. She looked at the door. 15 souls, Holloway said. 11 off a pinned convoy, and 4 off a downed aircraft in the North Fork, in weather that grounded everything else we had, in a pass that 2 of my most senior instructors have since told me, in writing, cannot be flown in those conditions. The flight data's been reviewed at division. Standard sent someone up to tell us it was impossible. He paused. It wasn't impossible. It was just her. And then Wade Holloway did the thing. "Warrant Officer Shaw," he said, "on your feet." Emily stood. Because you don't not stand when a colonel says it, and every head in that packed room turned toward the small woman in the back. And here is what happened. And it happened without a single order. Roy Cobb stood up first. Roy Cobb, who had called her the coffee girl on the flight line, who had begged her name onto a radio channel in the worst moment of his life. Roy Cobb was on his feet before Holloway had finished her name, and he was not looking at the floor. He was looking straight at her, and his jaw was set like a man determined to do a hard thing all the way through. And it cost him. You could see what it cost him to be the first man up, to stand in front of everyone as the one who'd been loudest and most wrong. He stood anyway. That was the point of it. He made himself the first because he'd been the worst. And standing was the only currency he had. Then Dale Brant stood next to him, without a word. Then Frank Doyle, the quiet man, 26 years around aircraft, who had said maybe on a fuel truck a lifetime ago, and then put a wall of fire up on a ridge so a crew chief could run. Frank Doyle stood, and he was not a man who stood for things, and he stood for this. Then Grant Sullivan, who had never doubted her, stood grinning like the whole thing was the best joke in the world. The good kind of joke, the kind that ends with everybody alive. And then the whole room was standing, all of them. The new pilots, who didn't know her yet, standing because the room was standing. The old ones who did know her, standing because they finally could. 30-some people on their feet in a low room at Bagram, and not one of them saying a word, because there wasn't a word that would have improved on it. The silence went on. 10 seconds. 15. The longest silence Emily Shaw had ever stood inside. And the loudest, a room full of people saying with their bodies the thing none of them could have said with their mouths. Some of them couldn't look at her. Curtis Vance, who'd touched her doorframe like a relic, was in the back with his hand over his mouth. Some of them couldn't look away. Nathan Larkin, on light duty, still bandaged, stood at the side of the room and did not bother to hide that he was weeping, because a man who has been pulled off a ledge is allowed to weep when the room finally understands what that means. And Emily Shaw stood in the back and endured it, because that's what it was for her, an act of endurance, being seen like this. She hated it. She had never wanted it. Her whole life had been about the work and not the being seen. But she understood, standing there, that this wasn't for her. This was for them. This was 30 people who needed to stand up, who needed to make the silence, who needed to be the kind of people who got to their feet for the pilot they doubted. She could give them that. She could stand and let them do it. It was the last hard thing the pass asked of her, and she did it the way she did everything, by holding still and letting the truth be true. Holloway let it run, and then quietly he said, "Take your seats." And the room sat, and he ran an ordinary briefing, because that was the mercy she'd have asked for, if she could have asked for anything. Frank Doyle caught her on the way out. The quiet crew chief, the one who'd watched her hands on the tail rotor on the first day and known something without being able to name it, fell into step beside her in the cold walk back to the flight line. For a while, he didn't say anything. Frank Doyle was a man comfortable with not saying things. Then he said the plainest true thing anyone said in the whole business, and it was worth more than the standing room. 26 years I've been around these aircraft, Frank said. I've seen a lot of good pilots. I watched you check that tail rotor the first morning, before any of this, and I told myself, hands like that don't freeze. I didn't know the half of it. He walked a few steps. There's 15 people, Emily. 15. They're going to go home. They're going to have kids and get old and fight with their families and burn the toast, and none of them are going to think about that pass most days, because that's the whole point of what you did. You gave them a bunch of ordinary days they weren't going to get. He stopped walking. Curtis Vance has got a wife. Larkin's got that sister. The 4 out of the North Fork have got whole lives full of people who don't even know your name. That's what you did. You didn't save 15 people. You saved everybody who was ever going to love them. That's a number too big to say. Emily Shaw stood on the cold ramp and let that land, because Frank Doyle didn't say things twice, and this one deserved to be heard all the way down. "Thank you, Frank," she said. "Nothing to thank," Frank said. "I'm just the one who said it out loud." The spring came, as springs do, half a world away from the pass. In May, in a small church in Ohio, with the windows open to the new green outside, Nathan Larkin walked his sister Karen down the aisle. He did it slow, because his side still pulled where the rock had opened it, and he did it upright, in a suit that fit him well, and he did not let go of her arm the whole way. And at the front of the church he kissed her cheek and stepped back and had to look at the ceiling for a second. The way you do when you're not going to cry at a wedding no matter what. He never told most of the people in that church how close it had come. He didn't tell them about the shelf, or the wind, or the empty fuel gauge, or the small woman who'd held an aircraft dead still against a canyon wall so he could climb up out of the rock and be here. He carried it quietly, but he'd sent Emily a photograph, weeks before, of him and Karen practicing the walk in their mother's living room, and Emily kept it in her flight bag. And on hard mornings she looked at it, at the man walking upright who was supposed to be dead on a ledge, and it was worth more than any medal she was ever handed. Ruth Mercer got a phone call every Sunday now, without fail. She was 71 that spring, and her hip was worse, and her tongue was sharper than ever, and she had started, in her flat, dry way, telling people that her old student was flying rescue overseas, and that she, Ruth, had taught her everything she knew, which was not entirely true, and was true enough. She never finished a single one of those Sunday calls without saying, near the end, that Michael would have flown with her. It had become the way she said goodbye. And every Sunday, Emily received it the same way, in silence, letting it be true. Roy Cobb put in for a transfer that spring, but not away. He put in to cross-train, to start the long road toward flight himself, 34 years old and starting over at the bottom. And when people asked him why, this crew chief, with 11 good years behind him, he said only that he'd been on the wrong end of a radio once, and he'd decided he'd rather be the kind of person who launched. He didn't explain it further. The ones who'd been there didn't need him to. And Dale Brandt kept flying in the back of Emily Shaw's aircraft. And he never laughed at her again. And once, months later, a new crew chief made a crack about the size of the pilot in the left seat. Some easy joke on a flight line, the kind Brandt himself had made a lifetime ago. And Dale Brandt turned on him with a look that shut the whole flight line up. And he said, very quietly, "That pilot has flown me into a place you'll spend your whole career praying you never see, and flown me back out. You'll address her by her rank, and if you're lucky, someday you'll get to watch her work, and then you'll understand what a fool you just sounded like." And the new crew chief went white and shut his mouth, and the thing that Emily had done for Dale Brandt got passed down the line to a man who would never know where it came from. Emily Shaw carried the pass with her, the way you carry the things that make you. There was a cost, and it stayed. The 4 minutes in the North Fork hover, the 100 corrections a minute, the grip she'd held on the controls with everything she had. It had done something to her right hand and wrist, a deep strain that never fully healed, a tremor that came into that hand now when she was very tired, a fine shake in the fingers that would never be steady again the way it had been before the canyon. It didn't stop her flying, but on long nights she'd notice it, the hand that had held 15 lives still against a wall, trembling a little now on its own, and she'd close it into a fist and open it again, and she'd think about the shelf, and she'd think it was a fair price. Cheap, even. 4 soles off a ledge for a shake in the hand. She'd have paid it 100 times over. A year after the pass, Emily Shaw stood on the flight line at Bagram in the early morning, in almost exactly the spot where Dale Brandt had laughed at her, where Roy Cobb had called her the coffee girl, where all of it had started with Grit blowing sideways and 3 men deciding what she was. She wasn't leaving the unit, but she'd been asked to do a thing she'd said yes to, which was to spend 1 morning a week with the new pilots, the ones rotating in, teaching them what the mountains did to an aircraft, and what the wind did in the passes, and how you flew a thing you couldn't muscle. Teaching, like Ruth. And this morning was the first of it, and there was a new pilot standing next to her on the ramp, younger even than Emily had been. A small, quiet woman named Tessa, who'd come in with the scores and the ribbons and the look of someone who'd already been laughed at once or twice on the way up. Tessa was watching the mountains to the north, where the weather was stacking gray against the peaks the way it always did, and she was trying not to look nervous and not quite managing it. Emily saw it. She recognized every inch of it, and she said the thing Ruth had said to her in the honest desert air a lifetime ago. The thing that had been handed down and would keep being handed down long after both of them were gone, down a chain of small doubted women, flying into passes that were supposed to be impossible. "You fly like you're apologizing," Emily said, watching the younger woman's hands. "Stop it. The air doesn't care if you're sorry. The air only cares if you're right." She nodded toward the gray stacking on the peaks. "Feel where it wants to go, then be there first. That's the whole secret. Everything else is noise." Tessa looked at her, and something in the younger woman's face steadied, the way Emily's had steadied a lifetime ago, under Ruth's flat, certain gaze. The rotors were starting to turn out on the ramp. The Grit was coming up sideways off the tarmac the way it had a year ago, the way it always would. Emily Shaw settled her flight bag on her shoulder, the one with the photograph of a man walking his sister down an aisle, and she walked out toward the aircraft with the small, quiet pilot beside her, level-eyed, at peace, into the wind and the mountains and the work. Behind them, the day came up over the pass. And somewhere 3 states away, an old woman waited for a Sunday phone call. And in Ohio, a man who should have died on a ledge went about an ordinary morning he'd been given back. And on a flight line at the top of the world, a woman who had once been laughed at taught another woman how to listen to the air. Feel where it wants to go, then be there first. That was the whole secret. Everything else was noise.